Good afternoon as you are coming into the space for another episode, another webinar of HBCUs Educate, sponsored by NASPA Region 3. I am your host, your facilitator, Dr. Kelly Dixon. Welcome, welcome. And we're going to get started as soon as we get enough people in the webinar. So be patient. This is definitely going to be an engaging conversation. I'm excited about the topic and how it relates to our institutions, our HBCUs. So welcome once again. And we will start momentarily. Just a recap in terms of logistics. If you've never participated in one of these webinars, you have the option of using the chat function for comments, questions, as well as the Q&A function for your questions. We'll take those throughout this conversation, and we're going to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end to honor you and your questions. So please make sure that you use those functions to participate in the discussion. And we will start momentarily. All right, we see some attendees coming in. All right, ladies, are you ready? Once again, welcome to another webinar for HBCUs Educate, hosted by me, Dr. K. And today we have the pleasure of having two phenomenal women that do this work as it relates to Title IX and student engagement on HBCU campuses. I'm so excited. I'm always excited about all my, but even more so when I'm able to do the prep conversation, and the prep conversation turns into a webinar itself, but it's not recorded. So if it's anything like our prep, you're in for a treat, most definitely. So we want to give honor to all of our historically Black colleges and universities, and definitely honoring the foundation and legacy that existed and started in 1837, giving kudos to Cheyney University out there in Pennsylvania. So here's my favorite part, to introduce some phenomenal people that I personally know. I have today as a guest speaker, Breona Hayes, who is a certified Title IX administrator with additional certifications in civil rights investigations, hearing office and decision maker, and campus survivor and victim services, boss lady. A lover of imparting knowledge, Breona has presented professionally, nationally on the topic of Title IX compliance, sexual assault prevention, and trauma-informed campuses. Breona has devoted her life to the passion of aiding communities of color and has a strong desire to create pathways to educational attainment through engagement and advocacy. Breona completed her undergraduate studies at Florida A&M University with a Bachelor of Science in Health Science, Physical Therapy. She also obtained her Master's of Arts in Mental Health Counseling and a Master of Arts in School Counseling from Webster University. Talk about educated. Breona is currently completing her Ph.D. in urban higher education from Jackson State University. She has served in several leadership capacities in her professional and social organizations, to include Bridges Leadership for Women in Higher Education, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and a fellow in the Higher Education Leadership Foundation. Welcome, welcome, Breona Hayes, who is also the CEO and founder of the Hayes Solutions Group. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. Next up, we have the very lovely Zakia Brown, who has served as Higher Education Student Affairs for over a decade. She's held roles within residence life and student housing, student engagement and campus life, diversity and inclusion, and student conduct. She was previously an interim dean of students at Central State University, having the honor to serve her alma mater. However, presently she serves as the Title IX coordinator at Lincoln University in Missouri. She is an advocate for all things HBCU, where the African proverb Ubuntu guides her work. I said it right. Right? A native of Cleveland, Ohio, Zakia received a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Central State University and a Master of Education in Educational Leadership from Concordia University, Portland. She is currently working on a doctorate in Educational Leadership with Higher Education Administration concentration from North Central University. Her research examines how racial loyalty and cultural betrayal trauma impacts sexual violence reporting behaviors from Black undergraduate women at historically Black institutions. Boss lady, again, doing the work. So we have some very educated women on the panel today, and let's just get right into the conversation because I know we only got an hour. So let's start off with the question of, how did you find yourself working in Title IX? How did you get here? Who wants to start it off? Zakia?
So kind of similar to how we do like the student affairs track, people kind of end up like being an RA or somehow and just end up in student affairs. Being in student affairs at one of the previous institutions, it really happened right after the Dear Colleague letter of 2011 was released. That institution was extremely focused on ensuring that the entire student affairs division was aware of Title IX and how to support students and what does that look like. So we had gone through extensive training on bystander intervention, from Here Comes a Bystander to Step Up to anything you could think of. We went through the training. Right. Shortly after that, I ended up leaving that institution and going back to Central State, where I was first the director of student engagement, but then also became the interim dean of students. And I started to recognize that just researching how do we have this conversation on campus for HBCU students, and there wasn't much information present. So for me, it was a thing of, I wanted to be part of that conversation. So I wanted to do more in regards to how we're having the conversation around Title IX. How are we talking about this with our students? How are we explaining and even bringing awareness to healthy relationships for our students? So I stayed in the role, so leaving from one, doing Title IX. So it was more so voluntarily, but it started off with the Dear Colleague letter coming out and me recognizing we need more of us doing this work at HBCUs.
Gotcha. Wow, yeah. Breona?
That is awesome. And like I told Zakia before, I love the route that she took to Title IX. It's so educated and well-informed. Not my story. Like most of us that work at HBCUs, we wear multiple hats. And at the time, I was the acting director of freshman executive initiatives. And so long title for basically, I dealt with our QEP, which was writing at the time. And so I was on the academic side of the house. I received a phone call from the president while I was at lunch and was asked, hey, I heard you have a master's in counseling. Will you be the Title IX coordinator? Well, what I knew of Title IX at that time was athletics, and I was at lunch with the assistant athletic director. And so she was like, yeah, take it. And I always live by the proverb, say yes and learn later. And so I literally came, it was a divine intervention how I came into Title IX.
So different pathways. Mm-hmm. You're both leading the charge, and especially in my opinion, as relates to Title IX at HBCUs. That's dopeness. So now that we know kind of, how you all got here, can you educate us? Because, and I talked about previously in our prep, me working in housing, I had similar to what Zakia said in terms of those ongoing trainings every year. And it's always the way it's taught that either sticks or doesn't stick. So can you, in your own words, kind of describe what Title IX is, especially for those that may not know what it is and what it really means?
So Title IX, and this is the way I explain it to our students, because again, we look at how to communicate this for them to understand. I explained to students that Title IX is a federal regulation that requires all educational entities, K through 12 and higher education, to put policies in place, practices in place, procedures in place that ensures or decreases incidents of sexual misconduct, gender-based discrimination on campus. So we are required to make sure our students are able to enjoy their academic experience. Our colleagues can enjoy their employment environment without experiencing incidents of gender-based discrimination or sexual harassment.
Right. Okay. Anything to add to that, Breona, or a different way of how you explain Title IX?
I believe Zakia did a wonderful job of giving the layman's term, because in my role of explaining Title IX, I often go to the language in the law. So I love the way that Zakia expressed that. Everyone can understand what we do.
Yeah. So when we think about Title IX, is it mandated that every campus has a Title IX coordinator?
So yes. So short answer is yes. I think, and as we talk further, we'll get into how that varies for HBCUs, but it is a mandate, a federal mandate, that every campus that receives federal dollars, so financial aid grants, must have a designated Title IX coordinator.
Okay. And can you all kind of briefly explain where that role situates in terms of organization on a campus in general?
So I'll give my experience, then I know Zakia will come in. And so what I've seen in the institutions that I have worked for and with, Title IX has often been housed in human resources. And I'll be the first to fall on the sword to say that I think that is a horrible model. While you can kind of see how certain laws mesh together, is a separate entity all in its own. And so some of your other larger schools, you will see that Title IX is housed in your legal affairs office, or it serves as its own with the dotted line to the president or chancellor.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I'm glad Breona said that. So where I sit in Title IX here at Lincoln, I'm under general counsel. But similar, like, I think within higher education, I think we're trying to figure out, where does Title IX go? Yes, traditionally it has been in HR because of the federal, I think it's the federal regulation part, because typically someone in HR has that legal background and understanding how to articulate federal regulations. However, because Title IX is really instrumental when it comes to the student experience, typical HR staff are not involved with students to know how to build that relationship, to create that connection for them to feel comfortable enough to report. So it does vary, because I've seen it where it falls in student affairs and somehow has a dotted line somewhere to some other area. But what I've seen at HBCUs have been a standalone office that has been, that reports directly to the president. And I've seen a under legal counsel, I haven't seen too many student affairs. I haven't, just personally, within higher ed for HBCUs, but a lot of PWIs have it underneath student affairs, and then it's other structures.
And so given that, and then given context to how you both differently came into Title IX, is it one of those spaces where I can just go get a certification and become a Title IX coordinator? How does that work?
So short answer, yes, right?
Okay.
But realistically, so certification is open to anyone. It depends on which agency which accrediting body that you choose to pay your money to and receive this certification. I will, however, caution anyone who is thinking to just go and get this certification that you need a baseline foundation understanding of what Title IX is. And I say that because Title IX, we say that and we talk about mostly sexual assault or discrimination, but that umbrella is so wide. It is really a catch-all title for the many areas and avenues that Title IX hold. And so while, yes, you can receive a Title IX certification, it does not mean you are a Title IX coordinator. It just means you hold that certification. Much like I would get certification in DEI, or I would get certification in advocacy, but I don't serve in the role of an advocate, so to speak, on the community level.
which that, Breona, leads to these terms. And so, you know, when we think of Title IX, these are typically the terms that we associate this with. So can you all kind of have a conversation around what these terms really mean and how it applies to Title IX, and what additional terms aren't we discussing that we need to discuss?
So, and this is interesting because if you've been following Title IX, these are the common terms that you will see in the new regulations, because before pre-2020 regulations, which is the language we typically use in Title IX, it encompasses so much more. So sexual violence is any form of violence towards another individual without the consent, that's not forcible. And I'm trying to get the exact language because it's really based off of the VAWA and Cleary definitions, where sexual assault looks at forcible assault or sexual violence, and then sexual discrimination is discrimination that looks specifically at the gender identity or the gender identity of that person.
Right.
The layman's terms way to say this without going into the legal language of it.
Right.
And so, and to piggyback off of Zakia, the 2020 regulations really sent us for a loop in terms of Title IX. It really pushed all of our efforts that we've been working so hard for literally back in the Stone Age. And that is even more encumbersome for HBCUs. And so some of the terms that we discussed that we didn't put up here, we talk about dating and domestic violence, right? So when you say what is Title IX now according to the 2020 regulations, well, that is sexual assault, sexual harassment, dating and domestic violence, and stalking. Whereas prior to these regulations, it covered a gamut of things like bullying. You could have had, and that included online bullying. And so, or maybe even hazing fell under that. So our hands as Title IX coordinators are essentially have been tied to stay in line with these terms. And even inside of those terms, because one of the ones that I love to talk about is the sexual harassment. And so it's not just, oh, I'm harassed. It has to be severe, pervasive, and objective. And so the word "and" is the new term now. Right. So it can't just be, oh, well, a reasonable person would say that was harassment. Well, was it severe? Was it pervasive? And so these are the questions that we have to ask ourselves as coordinators before we can even go into thinking, can we launch an investigation, or do we have to dismiss this claim?
So
what I want to interject and add though too. So because I think there's this perception that specifically for students is if we dismiss this claim, is that over? And it's not. It just has to be dismissed under Title IX, and it has to be forwarded to our student conduct, because now it has to be a question of, did it violate our institution's student conduct policy and not necessarily Title IX policy.
Right. And I'm glad you said that, Zakia, because we're talking to HBCUs, and I think this is where we sometimes miss the mark, because we say if it didn't fall under Title IX, like Zakia say, our students believe that there is no catch-all. So when I work with campuses, I love to say we have a 2020 Title IX regulations policy, and then we have a campus Title IX policy, right? And so your campus Title IX policy or Part A, Part B can be the catch-all for the things that the regulations cannot define. And so that way our students and our staff and faculty know that we still care, and that there is still a consequence for these actions.
I like that. I like that. Now, going back to kind of some of the things that you mentioned in the 2020 and that word of and persuade, all of those terms that you use. Who defines that? Because what is severe to me, in my experience, may be different for you all. So who defines what is severe? Yeah.
So
define that for me.
There isn't an operational definition in essence, and that's where it becomes frustrating for us when doing the Title IX work. Is like, you didn't really, And I'm saying you as in Department of Education with the new regulations, you didn't give us guidance in a way that made it very clear for us to know how to do this work effectively. And it's a thing of, we want to do this work effectively. We just need to know exactly what is it that you want us to do. So the severity of it is really, it's looking at the context of what happened. It's looking at the impact that the incident has had on the complaining party. But then it's also looking at all the evidence that comes to fruition or is presented. So it is subjective. The severity part can be very subjective, but it also requires a lot of investigation. So that's where, again, we start looking at whether or not how we are communicating this to our students, because once we start asking the questions of what happened and how do they feel and how did it make them feel and so on and so forth, it can start feeling like, well, do you believe that this actually happened to me? Because it may not feel like it was severe enough to the person who's doing the investigation, but yet it was severe enough to the person who experienced the harm.
Ooh. And I know we're going to get into this, but put this nugget that, you know, me coming from assessment, and I always talk about this whole idea of your personal bias and storytelling of the data. And I can only imagine what that's like for someone when we're talking about HBCUs and the Title IX coordinator doesn't have similar lived experiences or understand your culture in terms of what is severe and what is not severe. And I know we're going to get into that, but I just want to highlight that and how that shows up for our students in regards to what you're saying. You know, is this important enough or not important enough? Do they really care?
And I think to add to that, so the language that they will put is to a reasonable person, right? And then so you have to decide what is reasonable. And that goes back to what you say, Kelly. We think about it culturally. What may be acceptable in one culture could be deemed inappropriate in another. And so as you're working through these things, I think it's a really good idea for all your Title IX coordinators to always check themselves and their personal biases that they have, because implicit bias happens, right? And so in this position, we are to remain a neutral party. I'm not for the school. It's not for the student. You're for everyone, right? You want to be like I say, a solutionista. You want to make sure that you're providing equity across the board. And so when we think about that and look at that, you have to ask as a leader of a HBCU or even a PWI, who are we putting in these places? Who are we hiring for these positions? And the training that we're that we're providing from them to make these very serious determinations.
Gotcha. Yeah. Now, in terms of, and you talked about the 2020 regulations, what are some key, maybe top 2 or 3 things that HBCUs really need to hone in on as it relates to these 22 regulations for Title IX?
I'll start. Since I was already unmuted. And so I just talked about this right before my last statement about equity, right? And so now I think the past Title IX guidance really spoke to being victim-centered and never really thought about the respondent in a way, in a very crucial way. And so I want to do the intersectionality of now the 2020 regulations say that your practices should be equitable, which I wholeheartedly believe, but then we pull that on the HBCU campus, and then we have to compound that with all of the extra traumatic experiences that our students are already coming with. And so how do we then provide equitable supportive measures to the complainant and the respondent, and do it in a way that they do not feel ostracized or further beat down? Yes, and this is not making excuses. Yes, they've done something wrong. However, how do we correct so that it's not a continual pattern? How do we not discard them to the world? Because a lot of times they've already felt discarded prior to coming to campus. So it's a lot of, it's the both and. You have to do both.
Mm-hmm. What about you?
So another change that the regulations require is, the live hearing and cross-examination, and just being true and transparent. That's one of the pieces of the new regulations that makes me extremely uncomfortable. And I say that because we've gone to having our conduct process mimic our justice system. So you're talking about young Black and Browns. I think also our HBCUs are becoming really diverse, but young Black and Brown people, students who are on our campuses, who come from environments where they're already having this social experience of being racially marginalized. Mm-hmm. So that trauma itself. And then you're saying that you have to come and have a live hearing, which means the complainant and the respondent. So you're talking about the victim or survivor and the offender being face to face, and having a advisor serve as the attorney, and just for imaging, and they're doing the cross-examination. Just imagine how many of us feel if we get pulled over by the police. Right. And we are being asked, for whatever reason, we sped or might have been perceived as being speeding, or even our own experiences with attorneys. That intimidation itself creates this dissonance that it no longer feels like this is an experience for me to even learn from. I feel automatically either re-victimized, or I'm automatically found responsible. So I'm criminalized based on the concept of what happened because of how we structured our conduct process. So that's one of the things where, that's one of the most significant changes of the new regulation. Like, you have to have them face to face. It has to be a live hearing. They have to both be present. And if somebody does not agree to cross-examination, then whatever evidence they provided cannot be utilized to make a decision in that hearing. So now if I say, I don't want to be questioned I don't want to answer any question of the other person's advisor, then whatever I provided cannot be used in a decision determining responsibility.
Wow. I thank you for, one, I didn't know all of that, but thank you for recognizing, one, the racial injustice, but also both of you spoke to this idea of the learning piece, because they're on a college campus and you want them to learn. And so a lot of times, and I'm a big component of restorative justice, practices, and most people aren't, to each his own. But if you're in a college campus, the whole idea is for our students to walk out a little educated, more critical thinkers, et cetera. And that happens. Learning happens on the campus outside of the classroom. And so both of you speaking to, well, given the regulations and et cetera, how do we still give them that opportunity to learn from, so that they're not criminalized in a way or marginalized in a way that they don't think they can come from it, So thank you for giving space to that. Now, shifting to this whole idea of learning, what are some programmatic initiatives that HBCUs can instill on their campuses that relate to Title IX, whether it's awareness, et cetera?
So I love programming, right? Like, I started my higher education career doing programming for students. And so when I think about programmatic initiatives, for me, the outcome and the major goal is for them to walk away with the knowledge of what I'm trying to impart. However, I don't want them to just walk away. I want it to be a way of life, because if we are not infusing this and making not just the laws, but the understanding clear and a part of our way of life, we'll never be able to shift the culture on campus, right? And so our ultimate goal is to eradicate sexual violence. However, how do we get there? And so some of the fun ways that I think that we do that is we include the students. We talked about how do you make decisions or programs for students that you're not utilizing, but they are, and you don't have their input. Essentially, their campus is their home. That's their domain for the next 4 or 5 or maybe even 6 years. And so having input from students really guides the program, along with assessment. And I'm so glad you do this, Kelly, because we've had a conversation about how do you do anything on a campus and don't start from the data. Like, how do you not work from the data? And so I like to use pop culture as my way of infusing Title IX on campuses. And so I will do anything from, well, I created a consent week for all 8 HBCUs the last 2 years. And actually tomorrow starts Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so we had a month long, we had initiatives that lasted a month long, but Consent Week really honed in on that particular campus. So even though it was done across all 8 campuses, every campus has a different culture. And what matters to that campus was more evident. So while we talk about one campus may have an issue with dating violence or domestic violence, another campus may really have issue with sexual assault. And so getting programs that may be like a rap battle. We've done that. We've had ciphers to encourage our students, and more likely our male students who often shy away from a lot of conversations about sexual assault or prevention or bystander intervention. And so I think utilizing pop culture in a different way and including our students in those deciding meetings really is how I've been able to move about for Title IX programmatic.
Awesome.
So for me, I will admit, I did the prepackaged prevention strategy to our students. And we all know typically those products are not curated for our students. And it didn't go very well. And what I have done since then is I actually have honest conversations with them. So when it comes to like our freshman orientation week or when we have all of our first years come back on campus, I literally sit down with them and I have both male and female in the same space and ask them exactly, where did you learn about relationships? Where did you learn how to have a healthy relationship? What did that look like for you? Or what are some things that you would like for that to look like? If you did not learn what's healthy to you, what does healthy look like? Right. And just having that dialogue, you start having them unpack so much of what they've been learning in their home environments, their community environments, and they start recognizing like, oh, well, what I thought was appropriate is not appropriate. That will actually get me in trouble, specifically here on this campus. Let me not do that. But then it also got them to have more open conversations about what are they looking for? And it's now challenging the socialization of intimacy and relationships and dating and all these different things that they hear. They receive messages from everywhere. It starts to challenge that. And it even got to the point where I worked with our student engagement office. One of our staff persons there is a guy, and he started to actually hold male, I call them male healing circles every month. And the guys would just come and talk about everything. And it started off with holding a training on healthy masculinity for our male faculty and staff, for them to be able to have that dialogue with our male students. We recognize that having different conversations in safe space that are specific for men and women is different than having it in co-ed spaces. So what he's been doing with them has been phenomenal, because even they are saying they're now defining what masculinity looks like. What does that mean for them in this generation, this population of students, from where they are from, what their needs are as young men? It's so life-changing that it makes us do this work differently. So even at that point of, when you talk about assessment, I would love to see that be the reason that's why we have less incidents or less reports, because they're talking about it as soon as they walk on this campus. And that to me is an assessment tool. Like, we're not having that because of this. And that's just been like one of the several, like in prior schools, we've done partnerships with athletics to do stuff around consent and what does it mean to understand healthy relationships. You find creative ways, because we know we have to get to our students. But the biggest thing is helping them understand, have that conversation with themselves. What does this mean? And how do I get this? How do I get what I need in a healthy way?
Yeah.
And it's funny you just said that, Zakia, because as you were speaking, and I'm sitting here thinking, because I have a training coming up, social media is the best teacher for us, right? Because I'm going to utilize Quavo and Sweetie what the incident that just happened, and I'm going to flip that into healthy relationships, the do's and the don'ts. And so it's that easy, Kelly. It's just like utilizing the things that we know all of our students are definitely honed in on. They have their phones all the time. So utilizing Derek Jackson and his wife, right? And looking at the juxtaposition of the good guy supposedly gone bad, or how does that work for men, and looking at them in a culturally affirming way, to pull out some of the pros and cons of what they saw of that situation and working through that, because even in that teaches about healthy relationship dynamics.
Yeah, and I think, the biggest piece here is not just saying we're meeting our students where they are, but actually meeting them where they are. And I think I know in a lot of spaces, and speaking just for several HBCUs that I've, have mentees at, et cetera, we do a good deal of saying this is what we're going to provide and this nurturing atmosphere. And then you get these students and then they go on Twitter and it's something totally different. And we know there's three sides to a story. But still, how are we truly meeting students where they're at if we're not utilizing their feedback to inform the way that we do things? Because without the students, guess what? We unemployed. So why not use, their feedback and utilize the data that they have? It is a pot of gold that people are missing out on, and we think about this whole idea of burnout. And from an assessment point of view, I always tell staff, you're probably doing more than you need to do for these students because you haven't even inquired with the students what they need. But that goes over people's head. And so
that's the one right there.
And so, we're going to get to this idea of culturally affirming, but really quick, if you can kind of give preference to what Title IX looks like in a private versus public setting.
So the difference in that aspect really is, I can't even say, it's not even a really, it looks different across the board. Mm-hmm. And I say that because one of my mentees is the Title IX coordinator at Houston-Tillotson, and when the new regulations came out, she was calling me like, so do y'all have to do all this? And I'm like, no, we don't do that because we're not governed by a private association. So Houston-Tillotson is a private institution. I want to say they're underneath like the independent colleges of like Texas or some association, to where they had their own guidance. Mm-hmm. That had to, and she had to maneuver how to implement the federal regulations with the new, it was just a lot. So you have states that have their own regulations and their own guidance when it comes to doing Title IX work. But then the public sector, from my experience, is really the federal regulations. We might have some state stuff that comes out, but it's really depending on the layers. It's hard to say because when I worked in Carolina had their own stuff too as well. And I'm like, it's the USC system. Right, like exactly.
That's what I was going to say. And it also depends on who's the director of compliance at the system, right? Mm. And so that matters because I started in Title IX in 2014, and I started at a private school. So a lot of things were not required for us because we were not a public school, so we were not under the system, that I did not have to do. But I was aware of it. And now that I'm working with public schools, the person is no longer there, so there's no longer a requirement. And then there's no systematic way that Title IX is done across the 17 UNC systems, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's something else that you have to attend for. And it's also important to note, because now we just going back for a few slides, one of the new regulations is we can only adjudicate or have jurisdiction over what is on our property and our own student. Before, we would have professional courtesy where I could call maybe the school down the road and say, hey, one of your students has been named as a respondent in X, Y, and Z. We just want to work together. I don't know how this goes. Now, that's not even a possibility.
Wow.
Because if we don't have control of it, if it's not in our academic programming, if it's not on our property, then there's no jurisdiction that the Title IX coordinator has. You can report it for Clary, but we don't have jurisdiction.
Ooh, come on, y'all speaking knowledge today. So I want to be mindful of time, but this is a big slide. And Breona, you mentioned the term culturally affirming. So let's have this brief conversation around culturally affirming within Title IX. We talked a bit about assessment, but tapping into generational differences and also intersecting identities, which Breona, you also mentioned intersectionality.
I go home. So when I say culturally affirming, for me, is understanding that a lot of these laws were not written with Black and brown people in mind. The way that the overarching guidance has been given for Title IX has not been given with thought of Black and brown people in mind. And so how I think Zakia and I think about coming to our work, we have to remain culturally affirming, understanding the nuances that this population of student or faculty has experienced. So we talk about trauma, and trauma is not just, oh, they've already had an experience with sexual assault. No, they've had an experience with racism. They've had an experience with poverty. They've had an experience with being less than, or the struggles to just get to college, right? And so all of that is a very traumatic experiences. And then you put an assault that happens, or a harassment, or domestic violence, or dating violence on top of that, and it only exacerbates the issue. So I can't treat the symptom if I don't understand the underlying condition behind it. And so being culturally affirming is understanding, and that's just not for Black and brown. I mean, that's if you are on a PWI campus, that is being culturally affirming of knowing who your students are, having an understanding of the Asian population and how do they talk about sexual assault in their culture, having an understanding of how Muslim students talk about sexual assault. And so it is very overarching, and is very integrity laden in how we do this work and approach the guidelines and make it applicable to our campus.
Come on.
Which leads to why I'm doing my dissertation on the aspects of racial loyalty and cultural betrayal trauma. So the fact, specifically as you just said, Breona, when you're talking about Black and brown students, even at PWIs, you're talking about, I may share the race of my offender, and now you want me to go tell this person who does not look like me to implement this policy that was never meant for me, to implement this law that was never meant to protect me. So now, do I even want to say anything because I already know what's going to instantly happen? And this is, and I'm also not saying this too, because you have to keep in mind sexual harassment, sexual violence, and gender-based discrimination is huge. So this is for those incidents. It's like, yeah, they were stalking me. They might have been really awkward expressing their interests. But if I go report this to someone, now you're talking about the criminalization of this Black and brown male, because majority of the times, not always, men are the named offender. What's going to happen to that person? So now are they going to be seen as always this person, whatever label we put on them? And then if it ends up going further, I've now put my shared race male offender in the criminal system. Am I adding to that? So did I just betray the race?
Right.
Because I'm reporting this based on laws, systemic laws and practices and processes that's never meant to protect me from the beginning, going back as far as enslavement. So it's when talking about culturally affirming, it's even how we do this work. So how are we showing up as women of color? And I'm speaking just for me and myself and Breona, but as women of color showing up on these spaces and allowing our males to say, I was sexually assaulted, I experienced gender-based discrimination, I experienced sexual violence, and allowing them to feel protected and heard, believed in this space. So even that is the aspect of it. Can they feel comfortable enough to share that in our spaces? And we believe them, because even then history has shown that unfortunately at HBCUs, we have not believed the offender, whether male or female or gender binary. So even then, are we believing? are we creating that culture, that belief? So that's even the affirmation, because even then you're looking at the history of sexual violence towards Black women. Black women were never believed during enslavement. You were not rapeable because you were not property. I mean, you were not human, you were property.
Wow.
And that feeds into certain spaces. So it's even that far reaching when you talk about the cultural affirmation. It's huge. It's bigger than just making it appropriate for Black and brown people. It's actually looking at the context in which how we have been required to implement a policy that was really never meant to be a part of our safety.
Yeah. And I love Zakiya say that. And I know I get in trouble for saying this, but I'll say it because, I believe sexual assault is rooted in racism and oppression, right? And so when we start talking about oppressed people normally oppress others, and the heavy burden of the work of, like Zakiya stated, we've been indoctrinated as women of color to not put our brother out, to not throw him to the wolves. And then as Title IX coordinators, we're left in this very slim space between a rock and a hard place, because you want to uplift your complainant, if it's a young woman or non gender binary, you want to uplift them and let them know that we want you to report. Like, that is what we do all of this work, all of these programmatic initiatives and all of these trainings, so that you know how to identify what happened and so that you can report it. And then we also must do the heavy lifting of giving them the freedom and the grace to let that burden of how we've been indoctrinated go, for them to understand that while, yes, we are our brother's keepers, not when you're harming me. It is not your job to protect someone who is harming you. Right. Like, that's not our lot in life, right? And even to our young men, having that conversation about, it's not your job to protect whomever is harming you, and letting go of these falsehoods of what manhood is. And we can go down the whole rabbit hole of toxic masculinity, but that's enough. That's another.
We won't have to do a part 2 or have a bigger discussion around this at a conference or something, because this is dope information, and information that the way you're presenting it is applicable, right? Versus just the dryness of how it is sometimes presented. So I'm gonna move kind of quickly. We have about 13 minutes left. So, call to action. The response from an equity historical framework and changing the narrative. Both of you have spoken to this in some type of way. But if you can wrap up in maybe what is one call to action from your standpoint that you want our HBCUs to know or do?
Just one? Okay.
Okay, maybe 2.
So for me, I will stick with this, because as a consultant, I normally work with administration. And so I think the call to action is that we have viable administrators who don't just use lip service to say they care, but actually take the time to learn the nuances of Title IX and hire personnel that can bring forth the mission of a robust Title IX program on your campus.
And personnel as in a team, because the regulations require we have a team now.
Yes.
And I think the thing of that too is and I love our HBCUs, and I really do understand the financial aspect at times where we just don't have the financial resources to hire a robust office for many things. But this is one of those things of we cannot continue to shortchange this office because of what the regulations are requesting for us, but then also because the work we have to do better, the work we have to do to really show up for our students and even our employees, our colleagues. We cannot shortchange this. Like, the new regulations say we can no longer have this one investigator, one decision maker model, which we're used to having. We are used to having this one person do the investigation. They're the ones having the hearing. They're deciding. Like, we can't do that anymore. So now, really actually create a team. I'm not saying go out and hire 10 people if your campus only serves 500 people, but you might need 3 you need an investigator, you need a hearing officer, and you have to have a Title IX coordinator. Invest in having a real team and stop shortchanging us. It's hard work, but we want to do this, but we need the resources.
Absolutely.
Yes, I love it. So I want to give honor to you, Breona, for your company, because you do this as a consultant, and so I want to give you the opportunity to kind of speak to what exactly you do and how your focus is on HBCUs.
Awesome. So again, the Hay Solutions Group is a boutique consulting firm dedicated to culturally affirming Title IX and sexual assault prevention. And so what that essentially means is I not only work with higher education, but I also work with private sector and faith-based communities, which is part of the reason why I started my company, because a lot of us go to church, a lot of us have had trauma in church, but a lot of us don't talk about it. And we don't, I don't think a lot of times, and I'll say for this, because I'm Baptist, in Baptist, Black Baptist missionary world, it's a taboo topic anyway to talk about sex or sexual assault. And so often that this may have happened to quite a few people, male, female, non-binary, but we sweep it under the rug, right? And then we leave from church and we go to our daily work and we're still holding all of this trauma. And so I've been really fortunate to be able to take my expertise and move it across different subsectors of the world and actually get people to having real honest conversation and dig deeper. And but my heart is always HBCUs. Like, I will take on other clients, but precedence always goes to HBCUs because that is where my heart and my money goes.
Awesome. Thank you. So questions to those that are watching. What questions do you have? Please put them in the chat or the Q&A function. We have about 9 minutes where you can get some free expert knowledge. Please ask your questions or even the comments in regards to the discussion. And while we're waiting for those questions or thoughts, I personally, and then on behalf of NASPA Region 3, want to thank you for, one, your time today, and two, just your time and your efforts to the work that you do on our campuses as it relates to Title IX. It is definitely a work of labor and of love. And I can just tell just from hearing you all talk that it's genuine. You know, we can recognize a thing is a thing, right? So it is definitely genuine work. It is purposeful work. And so thank you for what you do. Any last thoughts as we await any questions or comments from our attendees from you two?
I just want to thank you, Kelly, for bringing this platform and this conversation. I think a lot of times Title IX gets overlooked, or we're sort of seen as the bad people because we're here to take lives and destroy. And that is not, I think, especially for Zakia and I, we have decided, took a very conscious effort to look at Title IX in a different way, and for our campuses and our students, and even for our faculty and staff, to provide education in the way that changes and shifts the culture for the betterment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any last thoughts for you?
No, Breona said it perfectly. Just committed to this work. So however I can help us do this better, I'm committed to it.
I'm not seeing any questions, which for me means that you did an excellent job where you got people stumped where I need to go read up on this so I can have some other questions to ask. But I'm seeing that there are no questions. I guess we can wrap this up. But once again, thank you. And I hope that you all take this opportunity to use this platform to leverage what you're doing in your work, not just locally, regionally, but nationally and even internationally, right? Because, you know, as I think Zakia stated before, the demographics of our students at HBCUs are shifting, you know, and how does that play a role? And you both talked about the culture of how we talk about sex and our lived experiences. So I'm looking forward to more publications and webinars and et cetera from you too. So it doesn't stop here. But once again, thank you for being here today. And just want to remind everyone who's watching that our next episode, next webinar will be April 7th. And we're talking about accessibility services and student engagement as it relates to the HBCU space. So once again, thank you for tuning in for another episode of HBCUs Educate.